Well, good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started. I think we still have people trickling in, but it must be a little too sunshiny and nice out there. They're trying to hold on to a little time in the sunshine and warm up before they come in. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm Steve McDonald. I'm a public policy fellow here, a global fellow here, and former director of the Africa program. I'm going to be very brief in my remarks this morning. I'll spare you the little blurb about the Woodrow Wilson Center. You all know about it already, I'm sure. But this is the kind of dialogue we like to hold here. We are always looking for the intersection of academics, practitioners, policymakers, and et cetera, and this is a perfect panel that we have in that regard. We'll be looking at narrowing the gap between international actors and local actors in the peace building in South Sudan. Again, I don't need to belabor for you the situation in South Sudan. We'll be getting to that to some degree here today. It's intractable. It's tragic. It's a situation that many of us have almost given up on. We can't seem to bring the parties together. So today we're going to be talking about what local actors and what international actors might be able to do in terms of peace building there and how they maybe can work together. I'm going to introduce all of our presenters at once. You've got their bios before you, so I'm not going to give a long biographic description of them. I'm also happy here in the crowd that we've got several practitioners from Bread for the World and Humanity United and Catholic Bishops' Conference and some others who do work in South Sudan and elsewhere. Our order of presentation is going to begin with Immaculate Liaga, who is a doctoral candidate at the Department of Political Science at the University of Pretoria in South Africa and has been doing extensive research as her doctoral research on South Sudan, has just returned from there in August of this year, where she spent a month or so and will be going back next year. She is Kenyan, but living in South Africa right now where she's working on her doctorate. She's going to open up with a presentation and be followed by Mike Jobbins. Mike is the leader of the Global Affairs and Partnership Team at Search for Common Ground, an old friend of the Woodrow Wilson Centers where he worked before, working with us on issues in Burundi, Liberia, DRC, and elsewhere. He's a longtime practitioner, and he'll sort of give us that practitioner's view from on the ground in terms of peace building, engaging local actors, and et cetera. And the search, he will tell us, of course, has an office now in South Sudan, and they are working diligently there, and he'll tell us about that. All followed by Carrie Grunlow, who's the Senior Conflict and Peacebuilding Advisor for USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation, CMMM, and she also has returned recently last year from South Sudan, where she was stationed and where she was the conflict advisor for the office, for a mission there, for the USAID mission there. So she'll have some good reflections in terms of what USAID is planning, how peace building might be unfolding, give us some sense of maybe international partners and what other international players are doing. So with no further ado, let me turn it over to Immaculate, who I think will give us a slide presentation, so she'll go to the podium.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Mr. McDonald, and I'm excited to be here. In the last few weeks, we've had a lot of conversation in Washington about South Sudan. Some of it was hosted by USIP with Ms. Susan Stigand, and the last one was hosted by the U.S. Holocaust Museum by Mr. Temin. So there is a lot of conversation happening, and I'm glad to be part of it. I'm going to, I like the setup we have here. We have the academic part, the practitioner part, and the government part. So I'm going to provide mostly an overview of my research, which is looking at narrowing the gap of international and local actors in peace-building efforts in South Sudan, and the rest of it in terms of examples and real groundwork you'll get from the practitioners and what they do. Sorry, I'm just trying to work this.
technical assistance?
Yes, might need some assistance. Right, so with a small outline, you're going to look at the background of what's happening in South Sudan. I'll just highlight a few things, then I bring in the problem that I'm presenting with the background of the peace building in context of South Sudan. I'll bring in now the local turn, which is partly what I'm proposing for the international actors who are presently in South Sudan. And that I will be highlighting the nature and the scope of the problem and presenting or suggesting a framework of partnerships before giving the concluding recommendations. So we all know about the conflict that started in 2013, and I want to highlight some of the aspects of the conflict. Part of it will be discussing the main players who have been believed to be the SPLM in government, SPLM in opposition, IGAD plus organizations and international organizations. But if you look at the conflict in South Sudan, there is a political dimension, intertribal dimension. You can see it between the Nuer and the Dinka, and intertribal dimensions as well. That can, for example, can be seen between the Jinkai Nuer and the Luo Nuer. So there is a dynamic relationship going on in the conflicts, but if we correlate that with the main players, it does not reflect that. It's not reflected. So the main problem which I'm presenting through my research is that peace efforts in South Sudan lack inclusivity, multi-level approaches, multi-dimensional strategies, and rigor to meet the intensity of the conflict. So there is need for vertical cooperation among the international actors, government of South Sudan, and local actors who are inclusive of the youth, women, religious groups, and traditional organizations. So the peace building that's been going on in South Sudan, if you look at the time frame from 2011 when they got their independence to 2013, just before the conflict, it's mostly a top-down approach, which include negotiations that have been going on between the government, the opposition, and international organizations, mostly state-level organizations. That's the IGAD group and IGAD plus groups, which include the Troika organizations, which a Troika group of countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Norway, as well as the EU. At best, these efforts can only achieve negative peace and not positive peace. We can see an example with the United Nations mission in South Sudan, where they allocated $14 million for peace building in the peace building plan. But in 2013, all that was stopped because it did not work. So the top-down approach will have negative impact on the immediate peace in South Sudan, which will not be able to reach the people, and the long-term effects will include international fatigue and incapacitated local organizations, which is what we are observing now. So efforts with the South Sudan non-governmental organizations and grassroots organizations have been taking place, but their efforts remain hugely unsupported, and they're very ineffective, and I'll give reasons as I go on. So I do call for the rethinking of the strategies used in South Sudan, especially in peace building, with the involvement of international organizations. So my suggestion is to take a local turn. That is, we should have a complete paradigm shift to look at the local organizations, at what they're doing, and ways in which you can improve their efforts. And part of this include opportunities such as maintaining strategies that are familiar in the communities through the local organizations, engagement with the communities that provide access to general population, focus on addressing the conflict issues by involving the local organizations, which do not always apply from the top-down approach. So we do. It also provides an opportunity for a counter effect to the government efforts. So the local organizations will put pressure to the government to maintain their agreements. For example, the agreements of 2015, which was never implemented. At the same time, some of the perpetrators of the conflict that started in 2013 are the local themselves. I'm just going to show a simple diagram which shows, I'm sorry for the color, might not see it clearly, but there's two different colors. There's the red and the orange. So the red shows the conflict situation areas, the hot conflict situation areas, and the orange shows where most of the international organizations have a focus. If you look clearly, there's only small spots where the international organizations are, and with ignoring the local organizations, we will miss a lot of South Sudan that has hot conflict situation areas. So I'm presenting two issues or problem. So the first problem is that the top-down approach excludes the local peacebuilding organizations from participation. And this exclusion is by ways of perception, where international organizations, especially the state organizations, view the local as just governmental level. And at the same time, some international organizations view local organizations as incapable of participating in their own building of peace. The second exclusion that local organizations face is exclusion from participation. This is, for example, through exclusion in negotiation tables and taking charge or ownership of their own peace. The second issue is lack of capacity, which is felt mostly from the local organizations who lack skills, management, and monitoring and evaluation capabilities. So we see three gaps that are presented. There's the recognition gap, there's the resource gap, and there's the solution gap. So from the gap, we can map five different types From the gaps, we see the scope of the problem includes financial exclusivity, which only international non-governmental organizations, for the most part, have direct access to finances. For example, with the UN. There's also financial leveraging, where the international organizations use finances to control activities of the local organizations. Grassroots organizations are overlooked more than national non-governmental organizations, so there's only penetration to a certain level, and the rest of the grassroots organizations are also left incapacitated. There's also a habit of project pasting, where organizations come already with their set projects, which are very inflexible, and they may not be appropriate for certain areas. The relationship that exists usually is also a subcontracting engagement to the local, and that is not seen as a true partnership of local organizations. So I'm going to, in my fieldwork recently, I met with 4 organizations, which I'm going to present some of the work which they do. And you will see that some of the work which they do correlate with some of the strategies that international organizations are trying to implement in South Sudan. For example, the Grassroots Relief and Development Agency, which is also called GREDA, works with women and the youth in training them in peace education. Integrated Development Organization work with refugees in ID camps and refugee camps in also education of peace. Community Empowerment for Progress Organization, SEPO, works in consultation on behalf of the government and other international organizations. South Sudan Network for Democracy and Elections work in promoting engagement in for parliamentarians to engage and have a conversation with the people they represent. So from this we see that peace does not need to be created. It can be, international organizations can use what is already there and try and frame it in a way that's more productive, and also partner up with the local organizations who are implementing these operations. So there are operational challenges that the international organizations will face. That's the finance, which is one of the biggest challenges. Disingenuous local organizations. South Sudan has been accused of local organization mushrooming up after funding has been available. There's also capacity and lack of capability of grassroots, lack of cooperation from local organizations who feel that they lose their individuality. There's the intensity and trajectory of the conflict, and also different conversations which are going on. I'm going to quickly present the framework of partnership which I suggest. That is, the international organizations should form a direct partnership with the government, which is what generally exists now, and also with mid-level organizations, with the encouragement of the mid-level organizations to trickle down to local actors and to the government as well. That will help provide vertical engagement. With the assessment of the current efforts, we are lucky to be joined with members from the USAID and Search for Common Grounds, so they will speak more on the assessment of their current efforts. But in terms of policy changes, the United Nations has proposed reassessment of their peace-building strategies and peace-building architecture. Also, we can see some efforts from United States Institute of Peace, Peace Direct, and UNDP in Juba. In my concluding recommendations, sorry. All right. Yeah. So for concluding recommendations for international governments and non-governmental organizations, form partnership with both the government and non-governmental organizations of South Sudan, target mid-level NGOs to build capacity in order to increase effectiveness, allocate responsibly and accountably through management training, increase funding to capacity building projects, interact with non-governmental organizations at both national and community levels. There's therefore need for coordination of projects, especially with organizations which have similar projects. International organizations can also target mission-oriented mid-level organizations so that their funding can also go to genuine projects. For IGAD, AU, and the government of South Sudan should recognize the participation of citizens in the national dialogue and guarantee that fear will not influence the dialogues. They should also provide a favorable environment for NGOs to operate, and IGAD and the AU should ensure community dialogue and inclusion in the revitalization processes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Immaculate. Remarkable. You really rolled through that. Sorry to pressure you, so I know there was a lot more to be said. But we have limited time, so let's move on to Mike.
Thanks a lot, Steve, and thanks, Immaculate, for that great overview and for the work that you're doing. It's like Steve said at the outset, the Wilson Center is near and dear to my heart. I started my career here as a program assistant, working then 12 years ago on a conference around the CPA implementation, and thinking back about sort of all the hopes that were felt then, and as we approach independence and where we are now, at a personal level, it absolutely gives me pause, and to be back in this room and talking about this issue is something that gives me personally pause, and it makes me think really how much of the kind of work that you're doing, Immaculate, is needed after billions of dollars spent and hundreds of thousands, if not lives lost. The question of what went wrong in terms of international assistance. Certainly the agency lies with the South Sudanese leadership, with the South Sudanese people to solve the problems there. But how many billions of dollars of taxpayer money went and yet we're still where we are is something that I think all of us should reflect upon with humility and certainly with thoughtfulness as an academic looking at this issue. So you're asking the right questions, and I'm looking forward to reading your dissertation when it comes out. Just to maybe throw sort of three quick points or reflections that came to me as you were presenting. The first is, if we look back over the post-independence period, from 2011 to 2015, so in 5 years, there was $5.5 billion of official development assistance going into South Sudan. Of that, $200 million, $212 million went to peace building. So, on one hand, that's a lot of money. On the other hand, that's less than 4 cents on the dollar. In what a recovering fragile state was actually going to solve the problems. And so, if I had a plumber, if my house sprung a leak and I asked a plumber, he said I spent 4 cents on the plumbing. I think that would be where I'd begin looking at why I had a leak. And I think that's where we need to begin is whether or not there was sufficient investment in supporting reconciliation, supporting South Sudanese organizations, supporting individual South Sudanese to deal with and rebuild from the trauma of a very, very long conflict. And I think that answer would be certainly no. And I think the international community spent an awful long time building castles upon sand. And it should be no wonder why we are where we are today. And of those that 212 million, for those here at the Wilson Center and for the program that you're a part of, less than 1 million went to supporting South Sudanese researchers, South Sudanese think tanks working on peace and conflict issues. And I don't know how many millions went into international consultants, but certainly I think it was $970,000 over the entire independence period went to supporting local research capacity on these issues. I think you did a wonderful job outlining sort of the bleakness of the situation in some ways, and I don't want to belabor that. At Search for Common Ground, like Steve said, we're one of the leading peace and conflict organizations in the world. We've been working in South Sudan only since the 2013 crisis. I was out there to start up our programs at the request of the UN after we'd been working elsewhere, and people asked us and recognized that there was a need for a fresh look at how you support communities and how you support capacities to overcome some of the legacies and divisions. We have a paper this is actually a soft launch. We have our paper outside that'll be formally launched later. I do hope you have a chance to take a look at it. But in it, we took stock of sort of where we see conflict in November of 2017 in South Sudan. And there are a couple of points I wanted to underscore. One is that what began as a higher level political conflict has now begun metastasizing, both with the fragmentation of armed groups, but also the normalization of violence. After seeing force used to such profit, and as suffering among ordinary people sets in, a level of criminality, sexual abuse, cattle rustling, and other kinds of conflict is equally claiming lives and equally disrupting and exacerbating the humanitarian situation. The second is that a culture of segregation is set in, which is not surprising to anyone who's followed it. The situation, but one of our surveys in Juba and Bor found that just about half of the people we surveyed interacted with someone from a different tribe fewer than 3 times a week. The number of interactions people are having, just the ordinary interactions between Dinka, between Nur, between other groups is decreasing, and that's a context in which escalation, and against that backdrop, is very, very difficult to imagine how any diplomats anywhere will build peace when you don't have a culture and you don't have a constituency for peace. There's being built locally, and that kind of contact and trust, if that's not existing at the grassroots, then it's very hard to imagine how you can do anything other than build a castle upon the sand. So Search, in that context, we've been supporting groups in Bor, in Juba, in Magui, in Nimale, to try to support local stabilization. So how do you recognizing there are a great number of challenges facing peace and security in South Sudan, but how do you help create a positive dynamic in the lives of ordinary citizens, to begin creating a track record where through dialogue, through problem solving, people can manage their own space and begin creating a momentum in favor of peace. I think many people now look back to sort of the one lit peace process, and that was a process that was an incredible, rightly hailed as largely a success, one that will never be exactly repeated as it had happened, but that process of putting faith in the ability of ordinary South Sudanese and ordinary South Sudanese institutions to rebuild. So, it's the Jonglei Women's Association, it's the traditional leadership that will have the future, it's the It's the chaplain corps of the South Sudanese army that can, hold a candle. It's these different kinds of points of light that ultimately will be the ones to shy away forward, and it's not going to be the diplomats, and it's going to take investment and support to those capacities. Where the other thing that we're doing is really trying to support a norm, recognizing that we're in a context where rule of law has broken down for many people, where you can commit an act of violence and not expect reprisal. If you do, it'll be at the hands of your neighbor, not at the hands of justice. So in that context where supporting traditional authorities, supporting the court system where it exists and where it can operate, but we're also creating radio soap operas. I'm a relatively well-educated American, but if I'm arrested tomorrow, 70% of what I know about the American judicial system comes from Law and Order. And that's the case for almost all of us. Our expectations of our governments, our expectations of justice, our expectations of how things will be settled isn't just forged in courtrooms and in back rooms somewhere, but it's also what we expect of one another and what we expect of our government. So we're supporting the Catholic Radio Network to produce a show called Sergeant Esther that tells the story of a fictional policewoman in an imaginary South Sudanese town as she travels about trying to investigate crimes, resolve cases between neighbors, and create and maintain a light on sort of how things could be and how things should be in South Sudan, what rule of law really does look like. So when the time comes for a more stable situation, those notions and those norms are alive, and while in the same time create an alternative to a culture of violence and a culture of revenge. And a culture that only expects that and doesn't expect anything better or offer any better options to a young or not so young South Sudanese person. Maybe I'll stop in a moment, but just to make a couple of recommendations of things that we've seen. The first is ultimately what's required now, apart from the humanitarian assistance and all that. It is an investment in the South Sudanese people, an investment of the kind that Immaculate articulated about an investment in the South Sudanese people in their process of making peace. Perhaps one day at a large scale, but at the moment, invest where it's possible, support what's working, and that's often not sort of the grand international bargains. It's the life of the woman who's bringing firewood to a displaced camp, although they're not from the same background. And those are the kind of investments that we need. It's the council, it's the clergy that are trying to stand up a process of reconciliation. Those are the kind of investments we need in South Sudan, and I think it's about both. In some extent, it is about the quantity of money going to this kind of stuff. In a lot of extent, like I think you highlight, it's also about the quality. Of the funding to the UN system over the post-independence period, 70% went to flexible funding, core support to enable UN agencies to respond rapidly to changing scenarios. Of the funding to civil society organizations, 8% went to support their operating costs and to support them in actually responding to a flexible situation. So there is a need to change how money is flowing about the system, both in South Sudan and I'd wager in CAR and Syria and many, many other places. And to do that, we need a different kind of action from Congress and from the American government as a leader here and a leader among its peers. The first is there's a piece of legislation that was introduced. It's called the Genocide and Atrocities Prevention Act. It aims to create the ability of USAID and other government agencies to respond rapidly in the kinds of crises like we saw in December and saw again 2013 and in July, to channel resources rapidly and effectively to civil society groups on the ground and to support America's diplomats and aid professionals in responding to those kinds of crises and stopping small crises before they become long ones. The second, Congressman Engel and Congressman Poe have been discussing and will soon be introducing legislation to take a holistic approach to the question of violence and how, we're 20-something years deep in crisis, 25 years deep in crisis in Congo, many cyclical crises in South Sudan. At the end of the day, we need American aid to be smarter. We need it to be more smart, more flexible, and more able to tackle the holistic nature of violence in these places so that we're not 10 years from now in South Sudan or 12 years from now, back having these same kind of conversations. And I think that kind of holistic look is super valuable. And probably the third, and maybe I'll stop here, is really to think as we look in and talk about how U.S. aid and U.S. assistance can be most valuable. It's also about increasing, and it's we have a rep from aid, but I think a lot of it has to come from Congress. And that's in how we loosen some of the regulatory burdens. Right now, it's about how, assistance in a transitional environment moves beyond sort of quick impact projects. Here, build this, rehabilitate this town hall, have this peace festival, but it's actually supporting South Sudanese capacity, supporting South Sudanese organizations to have something that'll last over the long term beyond quick impact projects. It's about pushing at the UN Peacebuilding Fund. I think you highlighted their reforms, and I think the pilot reforms are good, but it's a great chance to move beyond pilot reforms to not see the UN agencies as intermediaries for everything, but rather to support civil society directly. And so there's an awful lot that can be done from Congress, and every day that I spend talking to my colleagues in South Sudan, the courage and the spirit of the South Sudanese people come home to me. I think the value of what's working and the value that an investment in something that's working, the many things that are working can do to shine us a way out of this crisis is extremely clear. But we do need here in Washington and in many capitals around the world a different way of thinking about the South Sudanese people and a different way of supporting them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mac. Very good. Gary.
I'd like to thank both of my colleagues for their comments. Can everybody hear me? Okay. And build off of some of what you've said. It's always hard to go last because all of the good stuff has already been said. But hopefully I'll have one or two new things that I can add to the discussion. And so first, as all of you know, USAID has a very long and enduring history in South Sudan and relationship with the South Sudanese people. The context has changed significantly since independence and beyond, and we've had to adapt along with it. Our humanitarian assistance is very quick and flexible in adapting and responding to emerging needs, especially in a crisis context. Our long-term development assistance is much slower in reacting to those changes in context. And so that's been a significant challenge for us. Some of the changes in focus and strategy since independence include, as we moved into the independence period, we shifted from a state-building approach to, well, we continued the state-building approach, but the focus really was on sustainable development at a time when we probably ought not to have been moving in such a proactive way towards value chain agricultural development and other sustainable development goals. It quickly became obvious in the lead up to December 2013 and beyond that approach needed to be adjusted. And so after December 2013, we adjusted the approach to focus on resilience and service delivery in a crisis context. And then the second major focus was on big P and little p peace building. Big P in the sense that we wanted to support the formal peace process, and our support there was focused primarily on ensuring that there was civil society representation in Addis and capacity building around that to try to make sure that there was space at the table for civil society in that process. And then after the agreement, at the same time, little p peace building assistance at the community level, which we had been doing already for many years, including during the CPA period. At a very community level, helping communities to identify the drivers of conflict and react to those with local solutions. And so that work continued. So big and little P's and also conflict management capacities. Since the 2015 agreement, the focus shifted away from big P because there was much less space for that to little p. What can be done at the community level to help bolster communities' abilities to heal, but also to resist joining the conflict in as much as it was within their capacities to do so, because many communities were caught up through no engagement of their own in this conflict over the past few years. And at the same time, we were challenged to rapidly respond to the changing crisis conditions within the country. And again, as I noted, our humanitarian colleagues are set up to do that and to provide life-saving assistance in those conditions. And our development partners were less set up to do so. And so it required a sort of a fundamentally different operational approach. The current situation is, as you've all noted, it's dire. We have a third of the population is displaced, and more than half the population is severely food insecure. The outlook is not encouraging in terms of sustainable peace building. In this context, however, local peace building is critical. But it's not sufficient. And so to your point, yes, I completely agree that investment in local peace building and capacities, especially over a longer time frame, is crucial, but it can't replace high-level political commitment and processes at the same time. You need both of those things. And in the meantime, if we see that one is slow coming along, we really need to invest in the other. And build that runway, ensure that the capacities are there locally so that when there is more of a political opening, it can be successful. The peace can be grounded in local communities, in their conversations and their solutions and their will to recover, as you've noted. And I was smiling when you were talking about Woonlit, because that's an example that I intended to highlight in terms of characteristics of things that seem to work. But before I go to that, just to conclude what we are doing, there is a new request for information. So that's before a solicitation comes out for a new program, that goes out to announce that it's coming and to release a draft scope of work for comment. And so that's been on the streets now for a few weeks. And unfortunately, the timing of this is not good because the deadline for comment is tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Washington time. So that program is to promote civic engagement and peace. And so those comments are due tomorrow. We continue to be committed to peace building at the local level and to civil society's engagement in that, recognizing that there's both the capacity component, there's also a resource component involved in that. In addition to that, as all of you I'm sure know, there's the high-level revitalization forum that is in the works and is set to launch next month. That is a potential opportunity. And so if the process is inclusive and if the parties are willing to revisit those elements of the 2015 peace agreement that are not working, it could be a tremendous opportunity to push forward on that political level. Whether or not that possibility or that opportunity is realized, we have yet to see how it will play out. But in the meantime, we continue to invest in civil society and in communities themselves in small p peace building. As far as the State Department, because aid is not the only U.S. government assistance provider in South Sudan, they continue to support the monitoring mechanisms for the 2015 peace agreement, and specifically CTSAM for the security arrangements and the JMAC. And then on the AU side, the standing up of the hybrid court, when and if that proceeds. I'm prepared to talk about core challenges, but I think you know most of them, so I'll just hit a couple. And I think what we've seen over and over again over the years is that it's easy to substitute a focus on local peace building for attention to the political, because the political is just at times so intractable that's where you can make progress. But it is a significant limiting factor on the sustainability of those local peace investments. And we've seen that over the years in terms of communities that we've worked with for many years through our small P peace building program, and the ways in which they've still been caught up in the current conflict because the drivers are in many instances above them. They're not located at the community level. They've been able to address community level drivers, but they've been less able to intervene at these elite levels above them. Another one is that where violence is continuing, communities don't have the space to participate in peace building. Peace building is inherently about relationships and about improving those relationships and beginning to rebuild trust, and that can't happen in a context of active violence. And so that's been a real challenge, and that's why in many communities it's been one step forward, 2 steps back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, over and over again. And so I think that the importance of having that political opening at some point can't be underestimated. And then the other things that I had highlighted were many of the same things that Immaculate and Mike already highlighted, the weak capacities within civil society and the need to invest in that in a way that is a little bit more to scale, I think, has been a real challenge and need. And the restrictions on civil society, whether it's international NGOs and their ability to operate or local civil society, and how it's affected when you're trying to build capacity, often through external actors locally, but those external actors are not able to operate consistently. They're operating in fits and starts based on changes in the context and security. And then with regard to donor approaches, which is something that my colleagues haven't yet spoken to, other than I think Mike touched on some of the financing issues and the regulatory burdens that we face with earmarking of assistance. We have a funding problem. There are a lot of crises throughout the world, and the cost of humanitarian assistance in South Sudan is enormous, and it squeezes our ability to continue providing development assistance, or not so much development assistance, but longer-term peace-building assistance. And we've also had a problem with the sector assistance or siloing of peace building as if it's its own thing, whereas we see that it could be more effective if we infuse it in everything that we do. We infuse it in our health programs, our livelihood programs, our food security programs. There is money in those different sectors. There's very little money for direct peace building. And yes, that's an issue, but until that changes, we have to find ways of being more effective with what we've got. Not all donors have been on the same page, and that is a significant issue when you have donors that are not on the same page. There was an interesting effort early on in the conflict, early 2014, called the donor principles, joint donor principles, and there was a set of ongoing meetings that were loosely referred to as the donor capitals meetings. And in the first of those meetings, they agreed to a set of the set of joint donor principles that included conflict sensitivity and, ways of working and things like that. And not all of the donors implemented their commitments to those joint donor principles. And in the intervening years, especially with the rotation in and out of staff and leadership of the donor agencies, we've seen that it's become much weaker in terms of being on the same page, having a common plan, and all working together on that plan so that there's not quite so much fragmentation in donor efforts and duplication and competition, which is damaging. So I'll leave the challenges at that. In terms of characteristics for success, if we look at one that there were three things that are credited with being successful, one of those things was that the communities themselves were ready for peace and able to engage. The second was that those higher level leaders, in terms of the militia leaders, they saw an interest in reunifying, and so that fell into line. And there was a structure through the New Sudan Council of Churches that was able to support it. And so you had those three elements that supported success. And so sort of looking for those things now, where are we with those falling in place? Other elements of success are, looking at trade as an entry point. In Ural and Panyajar, in the former lakes and unity states across that boundary, we had examples of, we spent years fostering trade connections between the Nuer and the Dinka communities in unity and lake states. And when the current conflict broke out, they were reticent to, the Ural community was reticent to allow the SPLA to travel through during the unity state campaigns in 2015. And they had to go around into Jonglei state to pursue that offensive, because those trade relationships were valuable and they were connected to survival. And then later, the Nuer community in Unity State and in Panyajar and Ganyal, they responded when the population was fleeing from Ural as a result of severe food insecurity. They responded and they welcomed them and they provided assistance. Some of the women's organizations that we had been working with. And so these local peace building efforts really can yield successes if you focus on community interests and you build on what the community is already doing, what they need and what they care about. And so I will wrap up with that. I think in terms of concrete recommendations, conflict sensitivity has to be a part of everything that we do. And even if, for NGOs and local NGOs, even if your donor is not emphasizing and requiring it, I think that it's important even at that level to be looking at what you're doing and how it fits with the local context and who, who's benefiting and who isn't. Everything absolutely has to be locally led and driven and focusing on civil society capacities. And so I think that point has been hit by all three of us. And then finally, we need more flexible, better coordinated approaches to peace building in this context. We have to be ready for those openings when they come, and we have to have built the runway so that local civil society and local communities are ready to take advantage of the openings. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Carrie. All three very rich presentations. I am pleased to detect no disagreement on the need for emphasizing local actors and local solutions. I found throughout the years, and this includes in Burundi and elsewhere that we've worked, that when Track 1 efforts, the big P efforts as you call them, do founder, that Track 2 or the small P efforts can still go forward and can still be maybe the point of entry to get us back to the big P. And I find that the thread throughout all of your presentations. I also, of course, as we look back about missed opportunities, as Mike was saying, and what might have been had we picked up on things earlier, had we engaged certain communities earlier. The lack of donor follow-through, I mean, we saw that in Burundi as well. A pledging conference of $900 million in 2004 that never came into being. The need for long-term support that seems to fritter away when things seem to be solved, as we all thought maybe in 2011 and 2013 things were solved in South Sudan. And we all rejoiced at the birth of this brand new nation, which has now gone to a crisis situation. But let us now turn it over to questions and dialogue with our presenters. You probably know the rules. I will recognize 3 questions. We will take 3 at a time. Please wait to present your question until you get a microphone. Identify yourself and your organization, and make it a question. Do not make it a statement. I will cut you off if you do. So, hands are raised. Here's my first one. Dane.
Thank you.
Is it on? I don't think it's on. Hannah.
Thank you. In any case, I'm Dane Smith, American Friends of the Episcopal Church in Sudan. Immaculate, thank you for your interesting presentation. I noticed that of the groups that you mentioned that you were doing research on, that none of them seem to be religious organizations, and I'm wondering why that was the case and what you think about inclusion of religious organizations. I note that USIP is just getting launched with a religious mapping exercise with South Sudan, and I'm curious as what the panel as a whole thinks of the relevance of that exercise.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much, Dane. There's this next hand that I see right in the middle there. Nope, above, right there.
Yes, Will Farajaro, consultant in particular to Peace Tech Lab here regarding South Sudan. Similar to Dane's point on the role of religious, I'm interested more broadly about the role of diaspora. And there have been a number of religious initiatives from pastors in the diaspora relating to reconciliation and peace building, in particular in stemming hate speech. And so I'm interested in your assessment of the utility and, I guess, viability of external approaches or interactions from the diaspora to local peace building within the country. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Will. One more, right down here.
Thank you. I'm Laura Bosco with the American University and Impact Initiatives. And I have just two practical questions following up on the diaspora, the fact that a third of the population doesn't live where they live anymore, and how does local peace building work when the local lives in a different country? How you guys are getting creative. And then the second one, to the SIPO point, when I was in Juba last 2 summers ago, everyone was very worried about Edmund and that he would get killed. And I mean, he survived to date, but there's a real challenge in picking people to lead at the local level and then not providing necessarily the protection that they need.
Okay. I think Dane's first question was pointed at you, Immaculate, but I think all of you might pitch in on this one. But looking at the role of religious organizations and also this USIP mapping study, that how useful that might be, and I think maybe just have each of you respond to all three questions because they're pretty well linked. The diaspora questions that both of you asked, Will and Gloria, and stemming the hate speech, and then that very interesting question about vulnerable local leaders. What are we doing to protect them? But Immaculate, we'll start with you. Mike and then Carrie.
Thank you so much for the question. As Mr. McDonald mentioned, this is an ongoing project, and part of the first project that I did was in this August, and I went to South Sudan by myself with no organization. I had funding from a German organization, so it was very difficult to get connected to a lot of local organizations. Most of them, I went to one and I told them, please introduce me to another and stuff like that. I was lucky to get 20 organizations in the time that I was there. Unfortunately, I did not interact with the Sudan Council of Churches. But that's not to say I do not see the importance of churches. I'm just speaking on the specific research that I did and the contact that I had. And going for another research project next year for about 3 months. And so far, USIP held civic engagement with a bishop who I met, Reverend John, who I spoke to and I got his contacts as well. So I'm excited to go back and engage with that. But the role of religion and religious groups is very important, and you can see that from the CPA agreement of 2005. They were one of the biggest local organizations and civil groups that were invited to the table, and they held a very important role. And they also play an important role in most of the high political engagements that happen. To some level, you can say they're the gateway to the local organizations because they've been trusted by the government, they've been trusted by the international organizations to hold that position. If you look at the government's how they feel about most local organizations, they look at them as a means to propaganda from opposition groups, so they are blocked. And most of the religious groups do not face that kind of, not most of the time, do not face that kind of treatment from the government. So they are the access to the government that I recognize. I was just speaking in terms of my research, which I haven't yet connected to them, and I'm looking forward to doing that next year. I hope that answers your question. Should I go on with the three?
Yeah, why don't you go on, and we'll let you all flow. So go on with all of those.
I will let you speak on the direct diaspora question, but I have 2 points to bring on to that. And that's with for example, the NAF project. I've met 2 South Sudanese working on the NAF project, and they're doing a lot of good work on advocacy. And they're partnering up with other experts who are not South Sudanese here in Washington, for example, and working on that. So I think that's a big avenue for the diaspora, especially in Washington. If you look at some diasporas around Kenya in the RDP groups, they're also doing a lot of work to influence the IGAD members from where they are. So I think that's one of the roles which I'll speak to. The second one, I had a conversation with another researcher, and they're worried that when the diaspora, especially the refugees, when they start coming back to South Sudan, what's going to happen to the land issues? You know, like how are they going to interact and stuff like that. So those are some of the topics that the diaspora are engaging with right now, mostly prediction of the future, which most of the organizations who are working in South Sudan at the moment either have forgotten or it's not a priority. So one of the biggest conversations which I hear is to do with the land issue. What's going to happen when all the refugees do come back or some of them come back? That would be another problem. So that's why they're engaging in that, and they should engage in that. The last question is on SEPO. And I've spoken a bit about the intimidation that the local organizations do face from sometimes the government and more or less also the international organizations. And that's part of my recommendation, that the international community should be very aware of how the government is treating the local organizations. And that still calls back to my topic that once you engage with local organizations, you can also see some of the hindrances that they face. And apart from funding, which is a big problem, and capacity building, you can see some of these blocks that you don't necessarily need money to work on. So we can focus also on those issues. I think from me, it will be those comments, and I'll give time for the others.
Mike?
Thanks a lot. And just to complement Immaculate's points, Ambassador Cook's question, the Episcopal Church, or the Anglican Church, as we understand, is pretty engaged in supporting, along with the Catholics and the Presbyterians, supporting the South Sudan Council of Churches in their formal process. As I understand it, Lambeth Palace and others at an international level are really doing some pretty amazing work, or planning some pretty amazing work to support the Anglican Church there in South Sudan. And just to echo Immaculate's points, the religious leaders, both as an organized structure at a higher level, but also in their individual role. No religious denomination, like any other institution, has escaped unscathed from the crisis. But both the moral authority, the institutional capacity of these institutions across denominations is absolutely one of the key elements, and something that everywhere we're working, we have a strong participation with both with all of the churches that are present, and one to really look for. And that goes also to the diaspora question that Will asked. There is a deep tie between American religious communities in South Sudanese and the diaspora as well. The mapping and analysis of hate speech, and certainly engaging with diaspora and online influence, online personalities of all kinds is extremely valuable. In the same way as community radio years ago, nowadays, the norms haven't evolved around online speech and what's acceptable and not acceptable in South Sudan, and I'd wager in many countries, including here. But the biggest challenge to us, at least as we look at it, is not just that hate speech exists, but rather it's the reservoir that it taps into. And as long as you have de facto segregation between communities, you create a reservoir where hate speech is more likely to be believed, and more likely to trigger violence. And so the problem is ultimately the reservoir, but certainly the spark is worrisome as well. And to take the question about refugees, certainly in northern Uganda, there's an awful lot to do, and in many of the displacement scenarios, there's an awful lot to do locally, awful lot to do around access to information about what's going on back home, and to remove that as a proxy for escalation of tensions among refugees. And there's a long history of armed groups recruiting within refugee camps within the South Sudanese region. To come to the question of risk, I think certainly maintaining civil society space and the ability to do on-the-ground peace-building work, is one of the biggest capacities that serves the interests of the South Sudanese government, as well as every other person who wishes well for the people of South Sudan. So that's absolutely critical. At the same time, when we talk about actual physical risk, peacebuilding is not something that you just do when it's safe, that you just do when it's opportune. Every single one of our colleagues who's South Sudanese will be a South Sudanese today, tomorrow, whether they're working with us or not, whether they're funded by USAID or funded by, their work is sponsored by Carnegie or anyone else. They'll still be South Sudanese, and they'll still be committed to this work. And ultimately, I think that it's incredibly dangerous if we, as an international community, enable defer so much to the perception of risk. Certainly we don't want to do any harm, and we don't want to create unnecessary risk. But if we defer so much to the perception that peace building is a luxury you can have when the problems are already solved, that doesn't get us anywhere. I was struck by Carrie's point, and I really am completely sympathetic to the fantastic work that USAID is doing with the limited budgetary constraints that you have for the amazing amounts of life-saving assistance that are frankly, we'd be in a famine today if it wasn't for that kind of assistance, or in a worse famine than if it wasn't for that kind of assistance. At the same time, I mean, as an American taxpayer and someone who cares very deeply about South Sudan, I think it's absolutely outrageous that the best we can do is to deal with the Band-Aids and cope with the symptoms of one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. And there's nothing more we can do to invest in addressing the causes. That's unsustainable. That's how we've gotten to 25 years of war in Congo, of peacekeeping and humanitarian spending every 12 months for 25 years. And we'll be the same place in South Sudan unless we don't do anything differently. And I completely recognize that USAID is extremely tied by regulations and things like that, and that you guys are doing the best you can with the resources and legislation at your disposal. But at a bigger picture, it's absolutely unconscionable. And it's a moment that we all should really be taking pause and thinking about how we can really structure the U.S. Assistance, how the U.S. leverage can structure the international community and how it responds in a way to this South Sudanese crisis that we won't be back here again.
I would just add, so with regard to the role of religious leaders, we work closely with religious leaders in South Sudan through Catholic Relief Services. We are supporting the South Sudan Council of Churches to build their capacity to conduct community conversations. They've taken a model from the CNHPR, the Committee for National Peace, Reconciliation, and Healing. I hope I got that right. It's changed names so many times. Sometimes I give one acronym and then spell it out for a previous version. And they've been honing that model. So that was implemented before the conflict broke out in December 2013 as part of the then reconciliation process, but only in 2 states. And so the South Sudan Council of Churches was able to take the model, which is very grassroots focused, and begin to tailor it and hone it so that they will be ready when a broader reconciliation process takes off. But in the meantime, they're not waiting. They're working with communities. They're having those conversations. They're training community peace facilitators to be able to do that. And so religious leaders are one of those core constituencies, I think, for peace, and everybody recognizes that. So that work is important and will continue regardless of what happens with the national dialogue or implementation of the broader Chapter 5 of the peace agreement. In tandem with that, I think that we also need to recognize that religious leaders as part of the fabric of South Sudanese society have been affected much as their own communities have been. And so that was something that struck us really when we returned after the December 2013 violence, and immediately saw how wide-ranging the psychosocial impacts were, not just on religious leaders, but on everybody, on our own staff, on everybody. And so the other issue that we've been focused on in trying to address this, both with and through religious leaders, but with others as well, is a greater awareness of how psychosocial trauma can manifest, the impacts that it can have, and the relationship to things like revenge-seeking behavior and the role in peace building, but also the ability to absorb livelihoods assistance and other types of assistance. And so that's another thing that we've been doing that I think we feel very strongly is connected both to sustainable peace building and also enabling people like religious leaders to be able to provide that healing assistance to communities in ways that is conflict sensitive, that doesn't sort of feed the narratives of us versus them. In terms of displacement, you mentioned a third of the population displaced and the challenge of that. 2 million of those are internally displaced, both within communities and also in the protection of civilian sites. we have a number of different approaches that we're implementing to try to reach that constituency, from elements that are embedded within humanitarian assistance. For example, there have been several grants to the Nonviolent Peace Force for protection-related work, and protection is the humanitarian word for, some of it is similar to peace building. Helping people to remain safe, and some of that involves negotiating differences and disagreements. In addition to that, on the development side of our assistance portfolio, we've provided assistance within the protection of civilian sites to conflict management communities, to youth and women leaders, and camp leaders to manage conflicts that will arise within the camp, especially between different ethnic groups that have been in these camps sometimes at the same time. And then finally, the risks to civil society leaders. I think really as we move forward, and we've started doing this a bit, especially with CIPO and others, is considering our capacity building assistance to be much broader than what you would learn about in graduate school if you're talking about civil society development. And considering operational security and security of personnel to be an equal part of that. International NGOs routinely do that. Local organizations often don't. They have a much more nuanced understanding of the local risks, but sometimes they don't have the financial resources to address those risks. And so I think that as donors, one thing that can be done on the donor side is being attentive to those risks, as you've noted, but also taking an expansive view of the capacity building assistance that we're providing so that they can come up with their own solutions to manage that risk. Many of them will continue the work regardless of risk, as we know. So it's a question of how can we help them to help themselves be more safe.
Okay. Thank you for those very insightful comments. I'll take the prerogative of the chair right now for just a moment, because it concerns me when we talk about the role of religion or the role of the church, et cetera, that we're always Christian-centric here. We are dealing with a country that is at least 50% animist, traditional, not Christian, small Islamic population too. How are we trying, or do we know if we're trying to engage on the animist side, on the traditional chieftain, tribal, grassroots level there where most people are at?
I can start with that if you'd like. Our conflict sensitivity, our conflict management program at the community level has been running for many years now, as I mentioned before. And that program is grounded within individual communities and the leadership, including traditional leaders, religious leaders. It's not focused exclusively on faith communities formally, as you've noted as a concern, but it's grounded in really who is within the community and who represents them. And then those leaders are called upon to help identify what the risks are to the community and what sorts of solutions might reduce conflict in the local setting.
Okay.
So it's not exclusively through religious leaders.
Okay, thank you.
I think our approach is relatively similar. I think the one thing that I would highlight on the traditional side particularly is what we see is when we're talking about access to justice, and particularly who's seen as legitimate, credible, and able to resolve a dispute nonviolently. In all of, in almost everywhere we work, there's a very strong, among the things that are trusted, traditional leaders are particularly seen there, although trust in every institution is plummeting since the crisis. By far, the traditional leadership is particularly seen on access to justice. And so in as much as keeping a sort of a norm of nonviolent dispute resolution, if it's about breaking cycles of revenge that begin from sexual violence or ordinary threats, then the traditional leadership plays a very big role. And really, is something worth engaging with, and something that we certainly keep in the forefront.
Yeah, I think recognizing the role of customary law and how actually most criminal and civil cases are handled in customary law, I think that's part of what the hybrid courts is trying to address.
Yes, and we were working with the COTALs prior to the outbreak of violence in December 2013. Those are councils of traditional leaders. Oh. And primarily in Unity State, but also in Lakes and Warup,
Okay.
and in Jonglei, I believe, as well. And strengthening their ability to resolve disputes at their level.
Okay, very good. Okay, we have time for another round of questions. I see a hand here, Steve, down in front there, down in the middle, rather. I think one more question round.
Great. Well, thanks, Steve. Just a couple of recommendations, and to play off of what Dane and Carrie, you were saying. If you go back to the South Sudan Council of Churches, it's not just the community-based reconciliation that you were talking about, Carrie, but they have two other levels that they're working at. One is what they're calling these neutral forums,
Yes.
which attempts to bring whatever leaders seem to be the most dynamic in particular communities. It could be local leaders that are administrative or governors. They gave us one group of people that we spoke to when I was there just 2 weeks ago. In
Say
Pochala.
who we are, because you didn't.
Oh, I'm sorry. Steve Hilbert with the Catholic Bishops' Conference, the Office of
Yeah.
International Justice and Peace. And so they brought together the administrative leaders, because there were always fights when governors would change over, because they were picked by Juba. And when they came in, there was always resistance. And so the church went in and helped them work these things out. There are a couple other examples, don't need to go into that. But they're also working with the traditional leaders as well. I mean, whoever is available who has some authority, some legitimacy, they're working on that. So that's the middle level, Immaculate, that you were talking about, not just the grassroots level, but the middle level. So those middle level leaders, but who are close to the grassroots and have legitimacy with them. And then at the top level, the South Sudan Council church leaders, both Reverend Peter Guy, who is the Presbyterian moderator, and then Father James Oyet, who is the General Secretary of the obviously the Secretariat, have traveled to South Africa, and they met with Riek Machar, and they tried to convince him to attend the high-level forum when it revitalizes, hopefully. They've also met in Ethiopia, and they plan to go to Uganda and meet with Museveni. And so and then there's Bishop Parade Taban, who Steve, you remember meeting, I think, as well. He walks into Salva Kiir's house whenever he wants to. He walked into Paul Malong's office, or house rather, when he was under house arrest. And all these, when they tell these stories, what is clear is not just the people and the religious leaders, but also even the political leaders are all scarred people. This is a horribly wounded place. And for decades and decades of civil war, there are all of these events that have happened in these people's lives that no one has ever had the chance to sit down and think about and talk about. So, the trauma healing is so desperately needed, and I see it just within the religious leaders themselves. There are little things that come up, and you can just sense it. That sixth sense that people pick up. So there is a lot, Immaculate. If you want to really look into what's happening, they have those 3 levels. CRS is not just CRS and USAID funding, but it's also the
Others.
Norwegians and FinAid are involved in it as well. So you have them. And the fourth element of that project, so it's reconciliation, neutral forum, and then the what they call the advocacy activities, that meeting with the top levels. You also want to go to Europe and the United States later on, maybe next year sometime. And then it's capacity building. Because what you see in all of these communities is because of all the civil wars for so many years, no one ever had the chance, the peace and the quiet and the serenity to build anything. And so now they're trying to rebuild their structures that were destroyed during the Civil War, and never really had much of a chance to rebuild before the 2013 and then the 2016 events. So it's a lot of stuff to look at.
I thank you very much. You broke all my rules, but I let you
There
go.
were recommendations. They weren't.
There was not a question there at all. So,
But there were recommendations.
there were recommendations. No, I knew it was going to be useful, so I let you go. Okay. Any more questions? Back there. Right. Yeah. And then all the way at the back. Next.
All right. Thank you all for your good conversation this morning. So, Emma, I think we have met before, and I'm glad you are bringing this conversation into light. And
Okay, but introduce yourself.
yeah, so my name is Atem Malak. I'm a graduate student at GW. So I'm also focusing on conflict resolution, and I'm hoping to be one of those practitioners in the country helping try to bring country together in the future. So one of the things I'm interested is that I grew up in South Sudan. I relate with a lot of things that people are doing back home. If I had not come to school, I would participate in tribal division and conflict. I would do the same. But what I'm wondering is what is your organization doing to try to disassociate youth from their tribal leaders? Like, one of the issues that what people face is that if you have a leader, that person automatically become a representative of the whole tribe, and that is one of the things that is making this conflict continue, because if you are a Dinka, you feel like you're obligated to support Kir. If you are Nuer, you feel like you're obligated to support Riek, and the same with Equatorian leaders. Is there anything that your organization are doing to try to tell people these leaders are not your representative? They are there. If they are doing good thing, credit them as people that they're doing good thing. But if they're doing bad thing, you should not follow them blindly just because they happen to be from your tribe. Is there any conversation that your organization are doing to try to help people become more independently thinkers than just following because
Okay, thank you,
it's
Etienne.
our
That's a
tribe?
very,
Thank
very
you.
good question. And we had one more at the back. We'll take that question, and I think we'll be able to wrap up around these questions.
Hi. All right, it's on. Hi, my name is Julius Wani. I'm a research and consultant with Peacebuilding at the USIP. My question is to Mike and Corey. I was just wondering whether any of you have ever undertaken to do some sort of conflict mapping, identifying the actors and where they're getting their support from, and what you can do to, just like a follow-up to what Tim just said, what you can do to tame the support basis of the main actors. Because the conflict is dynamic, there are political actors. Who are their supporters and where are they based, both in diaspora and in the country? What can you do about that? There are also the traditional actors like the cattle wrestling. Where are they getting their support from? A very good example is the conflict in Jonglei between the Dinka and the Murle. Where are the youth getting their gun from? Who is supporting them? Because any effort just to try to resolve the conflict, talking to Machar, to Keri, is not going to help. Talking to all the leaders is not going to help, because they are not the one acting on the ground. They are being pushed. They are just representative. They're just there as, they're just symbolic. They are not. The pressure is somewhere. Have you guys done anything to identify where the pressure is coming from?
Okay, thank you. Okay, two very interesting questions, and we only have about 10 more minutes of session, so we'll use this as a wrap-up too, let all of you address them. First of all, extremely important role of the youth in general, and of course the specific question that Etienne asked about disassociating youth from tribal leaders and getting them to think on their own. And then I do think, I think basically what we're talking about is conflict mapping here. Who supports who? Do we have a good sense of where it's all coming from, where loyalties lie, where they don't, what interrelationships are? And we can just start, I think, with you, Mike, and go right on down to you, Carrie, as the final speaker.
Sure.
And you can say your final piece on this one, too.
Sure. Thanks a lot for that. So maybe on the conflict analysis side first. Search, we do a number of conflict analyses. We do have this paper, which is more of a summary and a policy document, but there's some more on our website we'd be happy to share. One thing that we find in South Sudan is, beyond sort of the grand conflict analyses, the value of sort of simpler, more localized, what we call conflict scans. So quick but iterative views on how the situation is changing in Bor and Jonglei, for example, and how the cattle rustling issues are changing with time. And so we've been doing these regularly since 2013 or 2014. I think the second question about, and to link your question and Atem's, one of the fundamental challenges that we have in South Sudan is that, or that we see, is that in many, many places, the vast majority of South Sudanese want peace. But there's, in every survey that we do, there's a significant constituency and an increasing constituency of people who believe that violence against another ethnic group is justified. We saw a 14% increase in the last year in Bor of people who believe that their community endorses violence against another group. And even at the outset of the crisis, I think about 20%, I could be wrong, but I think it was about 20% of South Sudanese believed that violence could be justified based on ethnicity. And in that kind of backdrop, it's very difficult to imagine any political process sticking. And things that link local processes like Steve was describing to the national level are absolutely important. But ultimately what we need is a constituency for peace. We need South Sudanese young people. There's the Ana Taban movement in Juba. There are other kinds of efforts that are attempts. There is not one vast movement that'll emerge, but there is a need for media and for the public discussions to begin honoring and giving space for youth voices, and for fundamentally for South Sudanese to expect, yes, in one way, like you said, Atem, for young people to carve out a different shape of their own future, but in the other sense, to also demand better from their leaders. And it goes in both ways. And so we're very engaged with different kinds of youth groups around the country, supporting that through the media, and trying to hold up examples of what's right. Because if you're growing up today in Bor or just about anywhere, the guy who has the gun is the one who eats. He's the one who is the one who's quickest to use violence. Is the one who gets the land, gets married, gets the cows. And in a situation where the people who are doing wrong, who are committing violence, are the ones who are celebrated, whether at any level. It's very difficult to imagine how there's a peace process for that. And so yes, certainly there's a lot that needs to be done at an international level. But at the same time, there needs to be a support to the heroes who are doing the right thing, to young people who do have ideas and who do want to share and do want to speak out. Radio call-in shows, prizes, celebrations for people who are doing the right thing, to honor a different kind of role model as well.
Okay, thank you. Immaculate.
Okay. Well, Mike took all the answers. But I will answer wanted to answer the question about religious leaders, traditional leaders.
Yes.
Just quickly before I go on. Although, from my view, is that the distinction between these leaders is very porous, such that if there is a church leader who is involved in a negotiation, he will be representatives of the other leaders in agreement towards the local. For example, a member of a Catholic church would not just say, I'm only catering for the Catholic local, but will also cater for everyone. So there's no strict distinction in that sense. Okay. And then moving on to Atem's question on what my organization is doing. As a student, I want to make an influence or an impact through my research, and I believe that the empowerment of the local will be a way through to do that. And although Kerry has alluded to that the top is also important, which I strongly believe, I believe that also using the bottom can be a way to uplift the top. So in trying to prevent leaders, traditional leaders, from influencing the youth, there's a lot of youth organizations which have been coming up, and empowering them and giving them education on peace is exactly what Mike has stamped as constituency for peace. So if you do empower the bottom, that is such that the traditional leaders will also have a difficulty in penetrating to the youth and influencing them. So it's the changing of the culture of conflict, which is the hardest thing South Sudan is suffering from, because it's been at war from 1950. So how do you change that psychological belief of war and revenge killings? And that's through the local organization. I don't see a way in which South Sudan as a government, except through the judicial system, and which is not there anyway. So we need to work from the top and work from the bottom as well, so that we can meet in the middle, and hopefully that will be a way of giving South Sudan some fighting chance for peace. In terms of conflict mapping, I was also struggling to find a lot of concrete mapping activities which have happened, especially from African organizations such as IGAD. Most of them came from international organizations, and I think some of the trusted ones are from ACLED and Uppsala Peace Conflict Mapping. And the mapping gives you a very good understanding of what's going on in South Sudan. And I'm not sure if USAID does provide that kind of funding, that kind of mapping, excuse me. But sometimes I feel like if international organizations do come together in that sense, that one organization does the mapping, the other one assesses it, the other one works on the mapping that's been found and on the analysis that's been found, I think in that sense we can also make progress.
Agree. It's always so hard to go last. All of the smart things have already been said. But in terms of responding to the question about youth, USAID has identified youth as an important constituency across all parts of our portfolio in all sectors. And what that means is that we are committed to looking at how to engage youth in each of these sectors and make sure that they have a role. One of our education program is sort of our education in crisis program is predicated on the idea that the youth will be the future of South Sudan. They are the ones who will pull South Sudan out of this situation that it's currently in. The current leadership has not done that job well, but there is hope for the future. And so we support a master's degree in education in crisis, and that program is meant to draw promising young educators from a variety of different ethnic groups across the country together into a single master's program. And it also includes conflict management and conflict resolution skills and some other sort of things that you wouldn't find in a normal education master's degree program. But this one is focused on integrating reconciliation into education as well. And so there's that program that is concluding now, I believe. Andrea, yes? Yes, she's nodding. But we also have a large education and emergencies program that works with small children who are out of school. South Sudan has one of the highest out-of-school primary education percentages in the world. And so part of our solution to that, and it's not a great solution, but it's a stopgap solution in the current context, is more safe spaces for children to receive basic literacy and numeracy education within a displacement setting. And it's meant to provide both a safe place, but also some assistance in terms of psychosocial care for young children, and then the literacy and the numeracy, recognizing that these children are not going to be able to absorb much if they're still reeling from their experiences and the things that they've seen. So that's one thing we're trying to do, and that is a very long-term perspective on that. But sort of recognizing that you have an entire country that needs to be educated, and without that, it will be difficult to move beyond the current conditions. With regard to conflict mapping, we do quite a bit of internal analysis on a regular basis. I think we have been pushing for many years now for more joint analysis with other donors. And also, the challenge in the current context with engaging communities, which is how we would normally want to see it done, is that the security situation doesn't allow it in many instances. So we found other ways to try to get local perspectives, advisory committees, to ensure that the perspectives of the people we are serving are represented and incorporated into our understanding of what's going on. And when you talked about conflict mapping, it needs to happen on many different levels. There is analysis at the very, very local community level, but there are other layers of conflict that exist at other levels and have drivers that are more macro level. And so you find good macro level analyses, I think. It's the local ones that become a bit more challenging and are possible when the humanitarian and the partners, the other longer term partners on the ground are doing analysis like Search is doing. And that can also inform the donors that are providing funding to those partners. So there is a great deal of analysis that is ongoing, but it does need to be pulled together more, and it needs to be more participatory in terms of local organizations and local communities.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to make a little concluding remark and call upon my elder's position as an old graybeard here. You know, this war has been going on basically for 62 years, since 1955. I first visited Juba in 1972 when Nyanya were still active, and we were trying to negotiate some settlement there. This is a tragedy beyond belief. Millions and millions have died. At least 2.5 million in those first two wars, and we're not sure how many tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, have been added to that in this last go-around. This is, as Mike said, I think very rightfully, a need for a constituency for peace, a need to build this. What the solution is hard to fathom, but I am very concerned right now that our attention seems to drift. We are not reappointing a special envoy after Don Booth has stepped down. We have an ambassador, I think, who's been nominated but is not being put through the process. That's being held up in many other countries as well. It's a part of this administration. But this is a time for advocacy. I think Mike made a very passionate appeal a moment ago about how we should be engaging. I do think South Sudan is a country that it is almost intractable politically. There may be openings in the grassroots and local areas that we need to investigate, and we've been talking about that today very constructively, and I think this has been very helpful. But this is something that none of us should forget. We should all push for, we should all advocate for, make sure that our own public representatives in Congress and in the administration are aware of our feelings about this. South Sudan must not be forgotten. We need to be engaged, and I hope you take that message home with you. Thank this wonderful, wonderful panel for me, and thank you for coming.